I hope you can all hear me. I'm really delighted to be here. I've got my guitar prop over there just to prove that I'm a musician. But thank you. I didn't expect you to mention that, but I am a musician also, and I do that with a passion as I do this, which is my day job. And delighted to be here with everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. And it was really inspiring to hear Dr. Gupta really kind of lay out the plan and, you know, the endorsement from the federal government around these endemic and epidemic issues that we are facing and have faced for a long time. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. See my slides? Yeah, I'm getting some notes. Thank you. Yeah, it was really good to hear Dr. Gupta, and I thank him for coming and really kicking things off in such a nice way. My goal is really to kind of give some details and some foundation to many of the points that Dr. Gupta has already made, and expand upon those a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, why we are where we are now in terms of this focus on recovery and recovery research. And I'll talk about kind of the rationale for that, as well as what we're learning and some of the gains that we've made in understanding how to best treat these disorders, as well as ensure remission, initial remission, and stable remission, and also some of the challenges that remain in terms of addressing these problems. Now, of course, we're used to seeing these kinds of graphs in relation to COVID over the last several years. We've also been used to, hopefully not inured to seeing these rises in opioid poisoning deaths. Opioids, of course, is not alone. We see 140,000 deaths related to alcohol as well. This is not headline news like the opioid epidemic has been and is. But nevertheless, we have to seriously pay attention to all of these deaths, endemic problems related to alcohol, the casualties there, as well as the casualties related to the opioid epidemic. Last year was a 50-year milestone since the initial declaration of the war on drugs, which of course marked a concerted federal effort in the United States to address these endemic problems. And we have made, in this regard, a lot of progress. This, of course, marked the birth of the National Institutes of Health on Addiction, also in terms of the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, which was founded in 1970, as well as NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse in 1974, as well as SAMHSA, CSAP, and CSAP, which have come along later to help states implement and support states' implementation of evidence-based practices around addressing these endemic problems. We also saw, of course, as part of the war on drugs, with which it is normally associated, which is the criminal justice approaches, which included in the 80s and 90s massive prison building to be tough on crime, but also tough on drug-related crime. This has not turned out to be an adequate solution to addressing these endemic problems, because we've seen these problems continue and in fact grow as we've seen. Now, nevertheless, in terms of the research that's been produced, we've learned a lot. Think about all the research that's been produced over the last 50 years, courtesy of NIDA and NIAAA. 90% of the world's knowledge on addiction has been produced by those two institutes over the last 50 years. This has helped reduce stigma and discrimination, particularly in terms of etiology. We understand much more clearly about the etiological factors, the causes of addiction, as well as the impact in the brain. We can see through neuroimaging technology now in the living brain how functional changes and structural changes occur as a result of chronic exposure to these substances. And these two factors, cause and controllability, are major factors underlying stigma. We understand now much more clearly that these are complex disorders like other genetically modulated disorders, and this has helped reduce blaming stigma, as well as the controllability. We can see more clearly how it affects the brain's neurocircuitry. which impacts, of course, controllability. This is why, of course, it is a psychiatric illness. It's the involuntariness of the disorder itself, that the continued use despite harmful consequences, which of course is a hallmark of addiction. Not only that, we've learned a lot about the risk factors in the population, the epidemiology, as well as the phenomenology in terms of people's experiences, the pathways into, through, and out the other side of addiction, which has led, all of this research has led to a number of paradigm shifts. I'm just going to go through these quickly. As I alluded to, in terms of bringing us to where we are now, we've learned a lot about the genetics and the importance of genetics. Roughly half the risk for addiction is conferred by genetics, which has led to new models of pharmacogenetics, the idea that we can create medications or test medications that can match potentially genotypes and produce more precision medicine care that we can affect change more efficiently and cost effectively. As I mentioned, neuroplasticity. This has been shown now very clearly in the brain, how the brain is affected through chronic exposure, both in the pathway into addiction, but also out the other side. When the poison is removed, Mother Nature can do her work, but also how these healing processes can be accelerated by the provision of the right environments and the right kinds of resources or recovery capital. Also, from a clinical standpoint, we understand much more clearly about the processes of change into and out the other side of these problems. This has helped us understand and also to compose different kinds of interventions that are better suited to addressing people and their challenges at different phases of the continuum of care, including pre-contemplation and contemplation, where people themselves are not aware of these disorders or may be unwilling at that time to make changes towards their substance use. And this has, of course, laid the groundwork for harm reduction services, which have been critically important, literally critically important in saving lives in the context of this opioid crisis, and also interventions like motivational interviewing, which have been developed to help resolve ambivalence among individuals, to help them move towards more healthful change. But also in the pre-preparation and action stages, the development of cognitive behavioral therapies, relapse prevention therapies, as well as continuing care services and recovery support services in the maintenance phase to help sustain remission. As I mentioned, harm reduction has been critical in, and increasingly so with this opioid crisis, the provision of these services to help reduce overdose deaths and also infectious disease transmission. On the psychosocial front, as I alluded to, the importance of things like motivational interviewing over the last 50 years, cognitive behavioral relapse prevention therapy, contingency management, 3 big ticket items in terms of their ability to effect change, to be adoptable, teachable, implementable by clinicians worldwide, which has helped to save so many lives and helped to alleviate so much suffering among individuals and their families. Very importantly, medication and medication development, methadone, buprenorphine, long-acting naltrexone, as well as medications for alcohol use disorder, acamprosate, disulfiram, and naltrexone as well. These have been particularly important in terms of dissemination and particularly in primary care. Now, related to that, of course, is the fact that we have ongoing challenges. It's a mixed bag. We've made a lot of progress, but we clearly have a long way to go. And I think there are these 3 remaining challenges, just some of the challenges. These are not all of the challenges, of course, but one is how to reach the 90% of individuals who meet criteria for an alcohol or other drug use disorder, but are not interested in accessing formal SUD treatment. So these individuals, of course, are progressing in their own disease disorder in terms of getting worse. Not everybody. There are many different kind of phenotypes of the disorder. Some will be progressing and getting worse, but nevertheless, even if they don't, they might meet it at a mild and moderate level. The question is how to reach those individuals sooner, because these individuals are still incurring physical health problems and also suffering from other kinds of social challenges because of these disorders. How do we reach that 90% that are not interested in accessing formal care? How to reach younger people sooner who have SUD in the developmental course of these disorders. Again, this is a challenge. How do we get the attention of younger people when they have these disorders at an earlier age so we can offset premature mortality risk, as well as disease and disability and missing milestones and all the things that come along with these disorders. And also, the thing I'm going to talk about most here today, which is how to help more people achieve initial and stable remission sooner. And this is why I'm going to focus on this in the from the clinical standpoint. We know that the clinical course of addiction, this is another thing that we've learned in the last 50 years as a result of all the research produced by NIDA and NIAAA, is that the clinical course for severe substance use disorder, or what we call addiction, tends to be a long one. You look in the middle here, it takes about 8 years after people start seeking help for an alcohol or other drug use disorder before they're able to reach that first year of full sustained remission. So that's quite a long time. It takes about 4 to 5 treatment episodes or mutual help episodes to be able to achieve that first year of full sustained remission. On the right-hand side here, that 5-year marker is the average number of years it takes after people achieve full sustained remission, that is to say 12 months without symptoms, before the risk of meeting criteria in the following year for a substance use disorder drops below 15%. Why 15%? Because 15% is the annual risk in the general population of meeting criteria for an alcohol or other drug use disorder. So to be no more likely than anybody else in the general population of meeting criteria for an alcohol or other drug use disorder in the following year, if you've already had it, takes about 5 years of continuous remission. So these are long time frames. Now, the obvious question here is, can we speed this up? Is this just an inexorable course of the illness? Or are there things that we can do to speed up the time to initial remission among these clinical severe cases, as well as the time it takes to stable remission? I think the answer is yes, if we look beyond the clinical pathology directly, which has been championed, and necessarily so, to the other factors which can help stabilize and sustain remission over time. I often use this metaphor of a burning building. I think it's a useful one. If we've done something right in the last 50 years, we've recognized the crisis. The building is on fire, we need to put the fire out. We've spent a lot of time on detoxification and stabilization. Absolutely crucial, of course, because you've got to put the fire out before you can do anything else. Now, the question then becomes, how do we prevent the fire from restarting? And also, how do we help those individuals to rebuild their lives, to rebuild that building? Where we have fallen short, I think, and I think where we're going to go next and where we are going, is on providing people with the scaffolding and the building materials to rebuild their lives. And also, very importantly, the building permit. Oftentimes, of course, people have criminal felony convictions related to their alcohol or other drug use, which prevent them from getting the very building permit that they need to start rebuilding their lives and accessing the building materials necessary. And I'm talking jobs, housing, social support, education, the kinds of things that people need to be able to get traction in their recovery. Now, we do know that there are many challenges in early recovery, of course. This is why it's so difficult for people to establish a foothold in remission from a neurophysiological standpoint. There are 2 major deficits which persist post detoxification and initial stabilization. That is increased sensitivity to stress and a decreased capacity to experience normal levels of reward. This occurs, of course, as a result of the chronic exposure, which changes the brain through neuroadaptations and neurotoxicity. And when you take away the substance, of course, people do not just suddenly snap back and start to be normal and go along with their business, but rather there is a period of convalescence and initial stabilization, post-acute withdrawal that persists, and these are some of the problems that occur. I think there are some useful models to think about this in terms of biobehavioral stress. One of them I like is Hans Seeley's original model of the general adaptation syndrome, and later Bruce McEwen's work on expanding the allostatic load, or the stress that occurs in organisms that can produce disease and disability and premature mortality. I think this fits addiction pretty well in terms of the alarm, resistance, and exhaustion paradigm initially explicated by Hans Seeley, the general adaptation syndrome in animal organisms, applies also to human organisms. Let me explain. First of all, I think the alarm reaction, which he proposed to be occurring within animal organisms, occurs usually with addiction. Usually when people make an attempt to stop their substance use, there is an alarming situation that triggers that stop. It could be a bad social interaction with a partner, a family member of concern, an arrest, or something else which brings people into this desire to stop and to make a change. That leads to a period of resistance, but the person can only resist for so long. This time I'm going to change, this time I'm going to do it. This time I'm really mean it, and they often do. But exhaustion sets in, and they become exhausted. They can't hold on for very long because they don't have the supports and the building materials needed to be able to persist. I've superimposed that model across the top, the notion of motivation and ability, of course, ready, willing, and able to make the changes. Of course, these are contingent, not just on those abilities and capacities, but the nature of the environment in which people live. This is the difficulty. How difficult is the environment in which people are living in place? And also the duration, the difficulty by time. How long do people exposed to these high-risk environments that can increase the risk of exhaustion? And so can we provide access to these building materials and scaffolding and the building permits that people need? And you can think of this as a kind of a biaxial and reciprocal process, whereby there is, when we provide more recovery capital, we can improve the chances of ongoing remission by reducing biobehavioral stress. And also that when initial remission occurs, it increases recovery capital naturally, but it's reciprocal, as you can see here, and more of each will perpetuate the other. And this is mediated by the reduction in biobehavioral stress. We do this allostatic load, which is so pervasive in the early period of recovery. So how do organisms recover? I think another metaphor is think about plant organisms. Plants disease plants, plants that have been undergone trauma or disease, when they're placed in the right environment and moved into the right kind of light and have the right kinds of nutrients and access to water, the genome can express itself as Mother Nature intended through this process of photosynthesis. I think of recovery as a kind of a psychosynthesis in the same way, but creating the right conditions such that the human organism can recover. And these are some of the conditions, I think, the nutrients, if you will, for the human organism to recover. And these relate, of course, to this notion of recovery capital or recovery resources. The social environment is often the soil through which other nutrients are absorbed and exchanged in the human recovery experience. Activity, physical activity, but also things like employment are critical and key to individuals' recovery. Nutrition, and all of these, I think, contribute to this notion of emotion regulation, which is a very important aspect. This adds up to this nice acronym of a SANER approach, a social activity, nutrition, and emotion regulation approach to psychosynthesis of recovery, to this notion of not photosynthesis, but allowing the right conditions so the human organism can begin to thrive and grow. I think this is in part the conceptual underpinnings as to why we've seen this growth in recovery support services in the environments in which people live. Some of them are listed here, starting with recovery mutual aid organizations, like 12-step organizations like AA, but many other flavors of recovery mutual aid are now available, as you can see here on the right. Dr. Gupta mentioned recovery coaching and other peer recovery support services, recovery residences, physical and recreational activity, recovery activities like the Phoenix, for example. The big growth in recovery community centers that we've seen around different states around the country. And we're working on uncovering their clinical and public health utility as we speak with new research funded by NIDA. And recovery programming in education and employment settings, things like collegiate recovery programs, recovery high schools, as well as recovery-friendly workplaces and recovery workforces. One other aspect that I think has been very important in terms of Dr. Gupta's comment is understanding more about who needs what, when, for what duration, at what intensity. Of course, this is an age-old question for any disorder. Who needs what, when, for how long, for what duration, at what intensity? So these questions regarding recovery milestones have become important, because if we can identify what it is, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the stresses, what are the strains, what are the challenges at each phase or milestone of recovery, we can start to target resources more specifically for different subgroups who may need different things, and the challenges over time in the dynamic course of recovery. When we look at recovery trajectories, these are data from our national recovery study, which was done a few years ago. We have roughly 2,000 people. This is from a nationally representative sample of the US adult population. You can see here with a 40-year horizon. So this is looking at zooming out and looking at the whole sample over 40 years of recovery. So these are people reporting different levels of these indices of well-being and functioning, as well as psychological distress, which is the red line coming down from the top, over this 40-year period. So what's nice here is that we can see this general incline, this improvement in recovery capital, in quality of life and functioning, in self-esteem and happiness, as well as decreases in psychological distress. What's also noteworthy is that the inflection point here, the significant change in the curve, happens right around that 5-year mark. Again, highlighting this first 5 years has been a very important period where risk remains elevated, and that recovery capital and these other indices are very important to monitor during that early phase of recovery. In terms of who needs what, we're beginning to uncover some of the subgroups of individuals who may need different kinds of services at different levels of intensity. Here we're looking at primary drug. You can see here in both of these instances of recovery capital and quality of life, that compared to people with alcohol or cannabis use disorders, people with opioid or stimulant use disorders start off at a distinct disadvantage, about 1 standard deviation lower in terms of recovery capital and quality of life. It takes them 2 to 3 years to catch up to their counterparts with alcohol or cannabis problems. So they start off at distinct disadvantage. So it suggests that these groups, not everybody who has a substance use disorder, quote unquote, is the same, that certain subgroups are more marginalized, more stigmatized. They have less access initially to recovery capital. It may be because of the building permit issue, because they're more likely to have more crime and more felony convictions that prevents them from gaining access, more stigma, more marginalization. What about race and ethnicity groups in terms of who? We're beginning to identify certain racial ethnic groups, particularly American Indian, Alaska Natives. You can see here in the yellow line that they are at a distinct disadvantage compared to other racial ethnic groups in terms of acquisition of recovery capital and indices of well-being. Sexual minorities, another group where we're finding disparities in terms of their trajectories over time. You can see here, look at self-esteem, for example, big disparity there in terms of differences over time between sexual minorities and the heterosexual majority. So challenges for certain subgroups in terms of who. Now, in terms of when, the dynamic course of recovery, again, recovery research is beginning to identify particularly vulnerable periods of the recovery trajectories. Now, one example here is when we zoom in the first 2 years of people's recovery, we can see here on the right-hand side, for example, we're just looking at the first couple of years here in the trajectories of recovery. And you see after that initial stabilization period in the first 6 months, in the first half of that first year, there's a drop in these indices of functioning and well-being. Now, what may be going on there is when we zoom in and we see this, is that this, to bring in that burning building metaphor again, is that after that initial convalescent period where the fire is out, the next half of that first year is where the smoke is clearing out of the building and people are beginning to identify and appraise the damage that's gone on, the reality of their situation. I kind of refer to this as a dawning of reality for people. This can create disillusionment. People look around them when the smoke's out of the building and they say, look what I've got to clear up. And they look forward in their life and they say, look what I've got to make up. And those two thoughts can be very daunting for those individuals who are beginning on that recovery journey. So recovery research is beginning to identify trajectories and recovery milestones depicted here. These are very preliminary, based on preliminary research. But the idea is that it's not plain sailing when we zoom in at more micro levels. And no doubt, more research will determine, again, who needs what, when, for what intensity, at what for what duration, as more researches will be done over the next 20 years and beyond to understand the process of recovery for those individuals entering the process. And you can see here again, this dip very similar to that dip in that general adaptation syndrome curve, where there's that initial shock reaction in animal organisms. There's kind of that shock reaction here, which provided when people have that dawning of reality, maybe in the second half of that first year after an initial convalescent period, where people perhaps are getting treatment, they're getting attention from family members, from treatment personnel, from friends, where there's that initial convalescent and stabilization period. After, in the second half of that year, there's that dawning of reality. And we want to watch out there. We want to provide hope and inspiration and monitoring to help people get through that period and instill hope that they can actually get through this. They can clear up the wreckage. They can look forwards and make up time that they perhaps have lost in the course of their illness. And these are important things to coach people on in that second half of the first year. That's what it looks like. Now, provided, of course, that they have access. If they have access to these building materials, this recovery capital, and the building permit to be able to rebuild their life, they can get going. And you can see in the second half of that first year that things start to improve again in terms of quality of life, recovery capital, well-being, and so on. And we can see perhaps this ongoing period of improvement over time in terms of reconstruction, if they have access to the building materials, and this notion of conservation and growth that can occur year on year that we saw in the 40-year horizon. I think it's really, really encouraging to see NIDA, CDC, FDA supporting recovery-oriented research in these areas. We ourselves have been the recipient of a NIDA R24, and NIDA has awarded many of these R24 grants to build infrastructure on recovery support, research infrastructure around the United States on recovery support services. I know we have many people here who are part of that R24 awardee network. So it's really fantastic to see NIDA stepping up to the plate and supporting this building of recovery research infrastructure to create new knowledge and discovery on these recovery support services to determine, to uncover how we can help more people achieve initial and stable recovery sooner. And as you can see here, there's been many different flavors of this approach, but the good news is that we're turning towards understanding more, as Dr. Gupta had mentioned, to really create an evidence base for the clinical and public health utility and cost effectiveness of these recovery support services, which are designed, of course, to help initiate and sustain stable remission.